I was taking the casserole out of the oven, the rich, warm aroma of melted cheese and fragrant spices wafting up as the heat brushed my face. It was one of those quiet moments I loved, a pause in the middle of a busy day where everything felt just right. The light through the kitchen window had taken on a golden hue, signaling that evening was drawing closer. I placed the dish on the counter, admiring how perfectly the crust had browned. Then the phone rang, sharp and insistent, slicing through the calm. At first, I thought about letting it ring. It was probably something unimportant, maybe a telemarketer, but the sound wouldn't stop. It rattled through the house, demanding attention. Finally, I grabbed a towel to wipe my hands and walked to the other room, where the phone sat on the coffee table. I picked up the receiver, expecting a mundane call, but the voice on the other end was unusually tense. It's Rachel. Are you busy, Rachel? My best friend since college. She was the kind of person whose voice usually carried a light, carefree tone, even in the midst of chaos. But now there was something off. Her words were clipped, and her tone held an edge that I couldn't quite place. Not at all, I said, glancing back toward the kitchen. What's up? Nothing serious, she replied quickly. Almost too quickly. I just wanted to confirm. Dinner's still at 7, right? Yes, of course, I said, frowning slightly. Are you sure you're okay? There was a pause on the line, just long enough to feel unnatural. Yeah, I'm fine, Rachel said, her voice softening slightly. I'll see you tonight. The call ended before I could ask anything else. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still in my hand, staring at the phone as if it might explain what had just happened. Rachel's behavior gnawed at me. It wasn't like her to call about something so trivial, and her tone. There was something she wasn't saying. Shaking off the unease, I returned to the kitchen, determined to focus on preparing the dinner. Tonight was supposed to be fun. Just Trevor, me, Rachel, and her husband. The 4 of us had done this countless times before, sharing meals, swapping stories, and laughing late into the evening. I wanted everything to be perfect, and I wasn't going to let a strange phone call ruin it. As I worked, my mind wandered. I thought about Rachel and me, how we'd become friends in our freshman year of college. We'd been inseparable back then, bonding over late-night study sessions and long conversations about everything and nothing. Ben had come into her life during our senior year, and though he seemed quiet and reserved at first, I'd grown to like him. He balanced Rachel's vibrant personality in a way that felt effortless. My life, on the other hand, had taken a different path. I married Trevor 6 years ago, and our relationship was steady, comforting. A quiet harbor in a stormy world. Trevor was everything I thought I needed. Dependable, intelligent, and kind. We'd built a life together in a charming house on the outskirts of town, with its picket fence and flower boxes. It was the kind of life I'd always imagined for myself. Yet, as I set the table and folded the napkins just so, a strange thought struck me. I couldn't quite name it, but something felt off. Maybe it was Rachel's phone call, or maybe it was just the way Trevor had kissed me on the cheek when he left for work that morning, quick, almost distracted. I shook my head, brushing the thought aside. I was overthinking, as usual. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. I chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and checked the time every few minutes. By the time Trevor came home, the house was filled with the warm, inviting smells of roasted chicken and herbs. He walked into the kitchen, his tie slightly askew, and smiled at me. "Smells amazing," he said, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "You're early," I said, glancing at the clock. "Yeah. I decided to leave the office a little earlier today. I figured I'd help you get ready." I smiled, appreciating the gesture, but there was something about the way he avoided my eyes that caught my attention. Trevor had always been a terrible liar. Not that he lied often, But when he did, it was written all over his face. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Of course," he said quickly, turning away to take off his jacket. I wanted to press further, but before I could, the doorbell rang. Rachel and Ben had arrived. Their arrival swept away the lingering tension in the air. Rachel greeted me with her usual warmth, hugging me tightly and complimenting the way the house smelled. Ben handed me a bottle of wine, his easygoing smile making me feel a little more at ease. We sat down to dinner, and for a while, everything felt normal. We ate, drank, and laughed, swapping stories about work and the little annoyances of daily life. But as the evening wore on, I started to notice little things: Rachel's occasional glances at Trevor, the way her laughter seemed slightly forced, and the tension in Ben's jaw whenever Trevor spoke. By the time dessert was served, the unease I'd felt earlier had grown into a gnawing suspicion. The room was filled with the soft clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation. The dinner had gone well so far, or at least it seemed to have. Rachel was seated to my left, her glass of wine almost untouched, while Ben was at the other end of the table, poking at his plate with his fork. Trevor sat across from me, engrossed in a story about his work, gesturing animatedly as he recounted a meeting that had gone sideways. Normally, I would have been entertained, maybe even joined in with a quip or two. But tonight, something felt off. I kept catching Rachel staring at Trevor, her brows slightly furrowed as if she were trying to piece something together. Whenever I met her gaze, she quickly looked away, smiling too brightly. "Rachel," I said, leaning toward her slightly, "you've barely touched your wine. Everything okay?" She blinked, as if I'd pulled her out of a daze, and quickly reached for her glass. "Oh, I'm fine. Just a long day at work, that's all." She took a sip, but the motion felt rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to appear casual. Trevor chuckled. "You should see Ellie when she's had a long day. She doesn't even pretend to sip, just dives right in," he said, winking at me. I smiled, but it felt hollow. Normally, his teasing would have made me laugh, but tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone at this table was playing a role. Ben cleared his throat, setting his fork down with a little more force than necessary. "So, Trevor," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "You've been pretty busy at work lately, huh?" Trevor nodded, seemingly unfazed by the question. "Oh, yeah. The new project's been a beast. Late nights, early mornings, you know how it is." Ben's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Yeah, I can imagine. Rachel was saying she ran into you downtown last week." "What was it?" "Thursday." The room went silent. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Trevor, whose easy smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, right," Trevor said, recovering quickly. "Yeah, I was downtown for a client meeting. Probably just a quick hello. I was rushing between appointments." Rachel shifted in her seat, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Yeah, something like that," she murmured. Something in her tone made my stomach twist. I looked between her and Ben, then at Trevor, who was suddenly very interested in his dessert. "Is this about something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, because it feels like there's something I'm missing here. Rachel's head snapped up, and for a moment, she looked genuinely panicked. "No, of course not. We just ran into each other, that's all." Ben didn't say anything, but the way he was watching Trevor spoke volumes. I felt a knot forming in my chest. This wasn't just an awkward coincidence, it was something more. I put my fork down and looked at Trevor directly. "Trevor, is there something you want to tell me?" He looked at me, his smile tight and unconvincing. "Ellie, come on. It was nothing. It was nothing. Ellie, come on. It was nothing. Rachel and I happened to cross paths, that's all. Why is everyone making this into a big deal?" But it was a big deal. At least, it felt like one. Trevor's tone was defensive in a way that set off alarm bells. Maybe because it doesn't sound like nothing, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I think I need some air, she said, her voice trembling. She walked out of the dining room before I could say anything, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. Ellie, maybe this isn't the time. No, I said firmly, standing up as well. If there's something going on, I deserve to know. Trevor stood too, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Ellie, seriously, there's nothing going on. Rachel probably just felt awkward. It's been a stressful week for all of us. His words didn't reassure me. In fact, they only added to the growing sense of dread. I followed Rachel out onto the porch, where she was leaning against the railing, staring out into the night. The cool evening air was a welcome contrast to the stifling tension inside. Rachel, I said softly, stepping beside her. What's going on? She didn't look at me. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and said, Ellie, I don't know how to tell you this. I didn't want to say anything tonight, but what? I prompted, my heart pounding. She finally turned to face me, her eyes filled with guilt and something else. Fear. I saw Trevor with someone. Last week when I ran into him downtown, he wasn't in a meeting, Ellie. He was with someone else. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. What do you mean, someone else? Rachel looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. A woman. They looked close. The ground seemed to shift beneath me. I felt like I was falling, even though I was standing still. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice trembling. I didn't know how, Rachel said, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't want to hurt you, and I wasn't even sure if… I don't know, Ellie. Maybe I'm wrong, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I turned and walked back into the house without another word, my mind racing. Trevor was standing by the table, his expression guarded. Ellie, he started, but I cut him off. Is it true? I asked, my voice breaking. Were you with someone last week? Not a client, not work. Just tell me the truth, Trevor. He froze, and in that moment I had my answer. The night that had started so warmly was now unraveling into something I couldn't control. Trevor's hesitation was brief, but in that fleeting moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. My chest tightened as his eyes darted from mine to Ben's, then to the doorway where Rachel stood, pale and visibly shaken. Ellie, Trevor began. His voice low and measured, like he was talking to a frightened animal. Can we not do this here, please? The audacity of his calm infuriated me. My hands trembled as I clenched them into fists. Do what? Ask my husband a straightforward question about whether or not he's been lying to me? If you want to keep this private, Trevor, maybe you shouldn't have made it public in the first place. His jaw tightened. It's not what you think, he said, but the words rang hollow. I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to my own ears. Isn't it? Because Rachel just told me she saw you with someone else, and judging by the look on your face, you're not exactly rushing to deny it. Rachel winced at the mention of her name, and Ben's gaze hardened. Trevor glanced at her with something I could only interpret as betrayal before looking back at me. It's complicated, he said finally. The room fell deathly silent. Those two words, as vague and cowardly as they were the only confirmation I needed. I felt like the ground had opened beneath me, swallowing everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man I had trusted implicitly. Complicated? I echoed, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay composed. That's all you have to say? After everything we've built together, after everything we've been through, you can't give me more than… It's complicated. Trevor ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Ellie, I can't explain it here. Not like this. Ben stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Maybe you should have thought about that before you started sneaking around, he said, his tone icy. Trevor's eyes narrowed. This has nothing to do with you, Ben. Stay out of it. Nothing to do with me, Ben shot back, his voice rising. It has everything to do with me when you're dragging my wife into your mess and hurting Ellie in the process. You're the one who made it everyone's problem. Rachel, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward. Stop, she said, her voice trembling. Just stop. This isn't helping. I turned to her, my emotions oscillating between anger and despair. Rachel, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't you say something the moment you saw him? Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Because I didn't want to believe it either. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was an explanation. But then tonight, seeing how he was acting, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Her words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with the doubts and suspicions I'd been suppressing for weeks. The late nights at the office, the vague explanations, the sudden distance, it all made sense now. I turned back to Trevor, my voice breaking. Who is she? He froze again, his face a mask of guilt and resignation. Ellie? Who is she? I demanded, my voice sharper now, cutting through his hesitation like a knife. Trevor sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Her name is Lauren. She's someone I met through work. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. My knees felt weak, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. How long, Ellie, please? How long, Trevor? I interrupted, my voice rising again. He hesitated, then finally muttered, a few months. The words hit me like a physical blow. Months. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a choice, repeated over and over again. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. Ben looked like he wanted to punch Trevor, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. I can't believe this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. All this time you let me sit here, planning dinners, laughing at your jokes, thinking we were happy. How could you do this to me? Trevor took a step toward me, his expression pained. Ellie, I never wanted to hurt you. I swear. It got out of hand. I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't know how to stop it? I repeated incredulously, my anger flaring again. You're an adult, Trevor. You make decisions every day. You chose to lie to me? You chose to lie to me? You chose to see her? Don't you dare stand there and act like this was beyond your control. Ben finally spoke again, his voice cold and sharp. You need to leave, he said, pointing toward the door. Trevor turned to him, his face twisted with anger. Trevor turned to him, his face twisted with anger. This isn't your house, Ben. You don't get to tell me what to do. No, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos raging inside me. But it's my house, and I want you out. Trevor looked at me, his expression shifting from anger to desperation. Ellie, please, let's talk about this. Not here, not like this. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my voice firm. You've made your choices, Trevor. Now you have to live with them. For a moment, he just stood there, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind him was like the final note of a symphony, loud and decisive. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. Rachel reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. I need a moment, I said, my voice trembling. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, needing space to process what had just happened. As I leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the casserole dish that had gone untouched, a single thought echoed in my mind. Nothing would ever be the same again. I stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours, my mind spinning. The evening had descended into chaos, and I couldn't seem to get a grip on anything. The smell of the half-eaten meal hung heavily in the air, a reminder of what had been ruined, what had always been there under the surface. I could hear Rachel and Ben speaking in low voices in the next room, but their words barely reached me. My head was filled with a ringing silence. I hadn't expected it to end like this. Not with Trevor, not with this betrayal hanging in the air like a dark cloud. The man I thought I knew, the person I had trusted with everything, had turned out to be someone completely different. It was like I had been living with a stranger, and the mask had just slipped away. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet, pouring myself a drink, the burn of whiskey grounding me momentarily. My fingers shook as I held the glass, but it wasn't from the alcohol. It was the shock of what I'd learned, of the realization that nothing in my life was as solid as I'd believed. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't say anything, just stepped into the room, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know what to say, Ellie," she whispered after a long silence. "I never wanted to hurt you. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I saw the way he looked at her. It wasn't just a casual meeting." I set the glass down on the counter, taking a steadying breath. "I'm not angry with you," I said softly, though it felt like a lie. "You were just trying to protect me, weren't you?" She nodded, her lips trembling. I don't know how I missed it, how I didn't see it sooner. It was always there, but... She paused, as though unsure how to finish. I guess I didn't want to believe it either. Trevor's been like a brother to me. I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts. My chest was tight, and I could barely breathe. "How long has it been going on, Rachel?" "How long has it been going on, Rachel?" "How long has he been seeing her?" Rachel hesitated before answering. "I don't know exactly, but from what I saw, it's been going on for months, at least since." That word echoed in my mind, rattling around like a stone in a tin can. I felt a sick, hollow sensation in my stomach, like I was going to vomit at any moment. For months, Trevor had been lying to me, and I had been sitting here, completely unaware. All the moments we had shared, all the plans we had made, it had been built on a lie. I felt betrayed, but more than that, I felt stupid. "I should have seen it," I said bitterly, my voice hoarse. The signs were all there. The late nights, the way he'd look at his phone all the time, the way he started pulling away. I kept telling myself it was just stress. I let him tell me whatever he wanted, and I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Rachel took a tentative step closer, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Ellie, don't do this to yourself. You couldn't have known. He's good at hiding things. He knew exactly how to keep you in the dark." The words hit me hard, and I was silent for a long time. Rachel was right, in a way. Trevor had always been good at keeping secrets, at playing the part of the devoted husband. But I was also complicit in my own blindness. I had ignored the growing distance between us, the subtle signs of something being off. How many times had I dismissed my own instincts, convinced that I was just being paranoid? Ben's voice suddenly broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His eyes were cold, his jaw tight. "Ellie," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I looked at him, suddenly feeling exposed. "About what? About what's next?" He stepped into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. "You can't just let him walk out like that." You can't just let him walk out like that. You deserve answers." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Answers? What answers could he possibly give me, Ben? He's already admitted to everything. What more is there to say?" Ben's expression hardened. "You're right that he's admitted it, but there's more to this than just what he's told you. Trevor's been lying to you for a long time. You need to know why. You need to confront him." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. Confront him? I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. After everything he's done, after he's betrayed me, yes. You want me to sit down and talk with him? Ben took a deep breath. You don't have to forgive him, Ellie. But you owe it to yourself to understand what happened. You don't want to be left with more questions than answers. The words hung in the air between us. Ben was right in some ways, but part of me didn't want to know any more. Part of me wanted to shut everything out, to leave this entire mess behind and never look back. Rachel, sensing the growing tension, stepped in between us. Please, she said quietly. I know this is hard, but Ben's right. You deserve the truth. I know this is hard, but Ben's right. You deserve the truth. You need to hear it from him, not from us. You can't move on if you don't know the whole story. I stared at the floor, my hands trembling. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know what Trevor's excuse was, what reasons he would try to give me. But deep down, I knew they were right. If I didn't face this now, if I didn't confront the man who had destroyed my world, I would never get the closure I needed. I took a shaky breath. Fine. I'll talk to him. But if I do this, it's not to fix things. It's to get answers. I need to understand why this happened. Ben nodded, his face softening slightly. You don't owe him anything, Ellie. But you owe yourself the truth. I walked toward the door, my heart heavy in my chest. The confrontation loomed ahead like a storm I couldn't avoid. There was no turning back now. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I saw Trevor standing by his car, his back to me. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. I took a deep breath and walked toward him. I wasn't sure what I would say, but I knew one thing. I wasn't walking away until I had answers. It's strange how quickly life can change. One moment, you're holding on to everything you know. The next, it all slips through your fingers like sand. I never thought I would get to a point where Trevor would be a stranger to me. But here I was, standing in the remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. I didn't hear from Trevor for days after our confrontation. At first, I was relieved. I wasn't sure I could handle any more of his apologies or excuses. But as the days wore on, a sense of quiet desperation crept in. It wasn't because I wanted him back, I was sure of that, but because I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. How do you move on from something that has shattered you to your core? I had always prided myself on being strong, on being able to handle anything life threw at me. But this was different. I felt like a part of me had been taken away, something I couldn't get back no matter how hard I tried. A week passed before I found the letter. It wasn't unexpected, but it still hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home from work, an envelope with my name written in Trevor's familiar handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether I was ready to read whatever was inside. But I knew I had to. I opened the envelope slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed out neatly, but they might as well have been written in ink that burned through the page. Ellie, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you or if you'll ever want to hear from me again, but I have to say this because it's the last thing I owe you. I am sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did, for the lies, for the betrayal. You didn't deserve any of it. You were everything to me, and I destroyed us. I can't take back what I did, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I regret it more than anything. I thought I could hide behind excuses, behind the things I was feeling, but I was wrong. I wasn't just running from our problems. I was running from myself. I was selfish and weak, and I hurt the one person who truly cared about me. I'll never forgive myself for that. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look you in the eye again, but I hope that someday you'll find peace. You deserve that. You deserve someone who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I was never that person. Goodbye, Ellie. Trevor stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity. my heart a heavy weight in my chest. There was nothing left to say, no more answers I needed. The man who had once been my world had laid out his regrets for me, but it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to believe him, and in the end I realized I didn't need to. I didn't need his apology to move on. The weeks after that letter were a blur. I went through the motions, work, errands, dinner alone, but it was as if the color had drained from my life. I wasn't sure how to feel, what to do with the space Trevor had left behind. He had been everything to me for so long, and now I was just me. Alone, but not entirely lost. There were days when I felt the sting of his absence, when I missed the man I thought I knew. And then there were days when I woke up and realized how much better my life could be without him. The clarity came slowly, but when it did, it was undeniable. It wasn't just that I had lost Trevor. It was that I had lost Trevor in him. I had spent so many years trying to make him happy, trying to make everything work, that I had forgotten how to be me. Who was I without him? What did I want now? The first real step I took toward healing came one Sunday afternoon when I walked into a cafe I had always passed by, but never gone into. I ordered a coffee, sat down by the window, and just sat there. No distractions, no plans, just me, in a space that was mine, with no expectations, no obligations. I realized then that I didn't have to have all the answers right away. I didn't need to rush my healing or force myself to forgive Trevor just because it was expected. I had been through too much to let the guilt of his betrayal weigh me down. Any longer, months passed, and I slowly rebuilt my life. I threw myself into work, took up new hobbies, and spent more time with Rachel and Ben. They had been my anchor through the storm, and I could see how much they cared for me, how much they wanted to make sure I was okay. They didn't push me to forgive Trevor or to forget what happened. They just let me heal at my own pace. And then, one evening, Trevor showed up. I hadn't seen him since that day we'd talked, but there he was, standing on my doorstep. His hair was a little longer, his face a little more worn, but the eyes that had once looked at me with love, were the same. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure what to do, but then I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing where to start. I had spent so many months avoiding this moment, avoiding him, and now that he was here, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But I knew one thing. I didn't need him anymore, not in the way I once had. "I'm sorry," he said, breaking the silence at last. "I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I needed to see you one last time." I looked at him, the anger I had carried for so long finally fading. "Trevor," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You don't need to say anything more. I've heard it all." He nodded, his eyes downcast. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." "I'm getting there," I said. "But I'm not the same person I was. And I'm okay with that." There was no more rage, no more bitterness. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive him, but I didn't need to. What mattered now was that I was moving forward, and Trevor was a part of my past that no longer held any power over me. "Goodbye, Trevor," I said quietly. And with that, he left, again. But this time, I didn't feel empty inside. I felt free.